When Clara Vance accompanied her husband Alexander to that crucial business dinner with Mr. Kenneth Tanaka, the most prominent Japanese investor operating in North America, she pretended not to understand a single syllable of the language she had meticulously studied for 5 years at her university. She sat in absolute silence, offering polite, measured smiles while her husband conversed with the client, fully convinced that his wife comprehended nothing of their foreign exchange. But Clara understood perfectly every single word that Alexander pronounced in his passable yet heavily accented Japanese. She sat there absorbing how he described her as a foolish, simple-minded woman, whose only real purpose was to serve as a decorative ornament for high-stakes corporate dinners. She listened to him apologize for having to bring her along falsely, claiming that she had stubbornly insisted on accompanying him to the city. She heard him promise the investor that as soon as this lucrative deal was closed, he would leave her for a much more sophisticated woman, someone who was truly on his elevated level. What Alexander completely failed to realize was that Mr. Tanaka had thoroughly investigated Clara long before this meeting was even scheduled, and the esteemed investor was about to reveal a secret that would permanently shatter everything her husband believed he knew about her. Clara Vance had learned the profound art of being invisible a very long time ago. It was a finely tuned survival skill she had developed during her turbulent childhood, in a volatile home where her father constantly shouted and her mother perpetually remained silent. In that environment, the absolute best strategy for self-preservation was to avoid drawing any attention to slip by unnoticed, and to exist without making even the slightest sound. That unique ability to blend into the background had taken her surprisingly far in ways that absolutely no one in her immediate circle had ever anticipated. During her demanding university years, while other ambitious students desperately sought constant recognition, loud applause, and the spotlight, Clara worked quietly in the shadows. She diligently accumulated vast amounts of knowledge, guarding her intellectual prowess as though it were a collection of secret weapons. She studied international business administration with a highly specialized focus on emerging Asian markets. She poured her heart into learning the Japanese language until she mastered it with absolute native fluency. She even secured a prestigious internship in Tokyo during a transformative summer that fundamentally shifted her entire perspective on the vast, interconnected world. But when she crossed paths with Alexander Miller, something deep within her carefully constructed defenses began to shift. He was undeniably brilliant, intensely charismatic, and exactly the kind of magnetic man who could walk into any crowded room and instantly command everyone's undivided attention. Clara, so deeply accustomed to her own comforting invisibility, found herself inexplicably drawn to his blinding light like a fragile moth to a dancing flame. When he actively began to court her, she was too swept up in the whirlwind romance to question why a man of his elevated social stature and obvious ambition would ever fixate on someone as quiet and unassuming as her. They were married after exactly 1 year of passionate dating, and almost immediately Clara willingly abandoned her own fiercely guarded professional ambitions to seamlessly transition into the role of the perfect supportive wife of a rapidly ascending corporate executive. Alexander smoothly convinced her that she had absolutely no need to work, insisting that he would easily earn more than enough money to comfortably sustain them both. He told her that her new most vital job would be to support his demanding career, to maintain a flawless home, and to be his peaceful sanctuary. Clara accepted this golden cage because she was deeply in love, because she genuinely believed in his vision, and because she romanticized the notion that pure devotion was infinitely more important than her own personal ambition. She simply did not realize that she was voluntarily surrendering all the intellectual weapons she had spent years gathering, inevitably making herself completely dependent on a man who would gradually begin to actively despise her for that very same dependency. The first few years of their marriage were relatively peaceful, or at least that was how Clara desperately tried to remember them when she looked back on their history. But as time slowly marched on, Alexander unequivocally began to change. Or perhaps, as she sometimes whispered to herself in the dark, he had always possessed this cruel nature, and she had simply been too blinded by love to recognize the glaring warning signs. It started with incredibly small, seemingly insignificant things that Clara valiantly attempted to ignore. They were tiny, sharp microaggressions that when viewed individually appeared completely harmless, but when constantly combined, they began eroding her self-esteem just as relentlessly as crashing ocean waves erode a solid stone cliff. He would make offhand biting comments about her physical appearance whenever they were preparing to dine with important clients. He would drop heavy suggestions that she desperately needed to dress significantly better because her modest wardrobe was simply not on par with the glamorous wives of his wealthy corporate partners. He would make cutting insinuations that she ought to apply far more makeup to properly conceal the dark, heavy circles under her eyes, completely ignoring the deeply ironic fact that those very same circles were directly caused by the sleepless nights she spent crying over his relentless nighttime criticisms. Alexander always smooth-talked his way out of these cruelties by adamantly claiming that he only wanted to help her seamlessly fit into his exclusive world. He argued passionately that high society corporate circles possessed strict invisible social codes, and that she desperately needed to learn them if she ever hoped to be considered a truly excellent wife. He consistently presented his harsh critiques as incredibly affectionate advice, framing his emotional abuse as genuine concern for her overall well-being. He positioned himself as the superior intellectual, who inherently understood the complex workings of the world far better than her simple mind ever could. Clara, clinging to her lifelong habit of self-preservation, genuinely tried to adapt because adapting was exactly what she had always done to survive turbulent situations. She dutifully purchased the expensive, flashy clothing he suggested, even though her efforts were somehow never quite enough to fully satisfy his ever-changing standards. She quietly adopted the sophisticated hairstyles and manicured looks he preferred, though he always magically found some minuscule defect to loudly point out. She swallowed her own intelligent opinions when he indicated with a single deeply freezing glare that she was speaking far too much, or supposedly saying something socially inappropriate. Every single correction, every sigh of disappointment, and every rolled eye served as another heavy brick in the suffocating invisible prison that he was systematically building around her. Bit by bit, the fiercely intelligent woman, who had flawlessly mastered the complex Japanese language through 5 grueling years of intensive study, began to fade away into a mere ghost. The vibrant student who had once passionately dreamed of working in the bustling heart of Tokyo, successfully negotiating massive international trade contracts, slowly vanished. The exceptional scholar, whom university professors still fondly remembered as one of the absolutely most brilliant minds of her entire generation, was systematically reduced to a hollow shell. In her place stood a drastically diminished, watered-down version of herself, a woman who seemingly existed for the sole purpose of complementing her husband's carefully curated public image. She had become a literal shadow, a quiet entity that only moved when he distinctly commanded it, and only spoke when he explicitly granted her permission. As the years dragged on, the comments morphed from passive-aggressive suggestions into blatantly cruel insults, completely losing even the thinnest, most fragile veil of being well-intentioned marital advice. Alexander confidently began to criticize her openly in front of his esteemed colleagues during lavish business dinners. These were calculated, agonizing public humiliations that he thinly disguised as playful, harmless jokes about how wonderfully clueless his dear wife was. He would laughingly declare how incredibly little she understood about the complex world of high finance, and how phenomenally lucky she was to have a capable man like him to handle all the difficult adult responsibilities. The other men at the table always laughed heartily right along with him simply because he was the powerful boss or the wealthy client, and absolutely no one ever dared to directly contradict a man with that much financial leverage. And Clara, trapped in her role, forced herself to smile brightly too, because bitter experience had firmly taught her that boldly protesting in public only ever made the private behind-closed-doors retaliation significantly worse. Deep inside her chest, something foundational was slowly, agonizingly cracking. It was exactly like a tiny, almost invisible fissure in a thick pane of glass that painstakingly grows millimeter by millimeter, spreading its spiderweb veins of structural weakness until eventually the entire pane is destined to violently shatter. But Clara constantly gaslighted herself into believing that this toxic dynamic was perfectly normal. She repeatedly told herself that absolutely all long-term marriages inevitably suffered through rough patches and complicated problems. She convinced herself that she simply needed to try significantly harder to become the flawless wife that a man of his stature truly deserved. In her emotionally battered mind, the lingering fault surely had to be entirely hers, in some profound, mysterious way that she simply lacked the basic intelligence to understand. She thought if she just stayed quieter, smiled wider, and looked prettier, the loving man she had originally married would magically return to her. What Alexander did not know, and what he had never once bothered to genuinely try to discover about the woman he shared a bed with, was that Clara had never actually forgotten her beloved Japanese. In the quiet, lonely hours of the day when he was away at his towering glass office, she practiced it in strict, absolute secrecy. She consumed foreign media voraciously, watching complex television series and reading dense intellectual literature from overseas. It was her way of fiercely keeping alive that one sacred part of her true identity that her husband had never truly known nor ever genuinely valued. It served as her small, incredibly silent daily rebellion. Every perfectly translated sentence she read was a comforting reminder that she had actually been someone of great substance and immense potential long before she had ever been reduced to merely being Mrs. Miller. It was a lifeline she held onto, a secret garden of the mind where Alexander's harsh, critical voice had absolutely no power to reach her. And then the highly anticipated dinner with Mr. Kenneth Tanaka finally arrived on their social calendar. Kenneth Tanaka was universally recognized as one of the absolute most powerful and influential corporate investors currently operating within the United States and Japan. He was a distinguished man of 70 years who had painstakingly built a massive, unstoppable technological empire, starting from a tiny, incredibly humble mechanical workshop in Osaka. Now, he ruthlessly yet fairly controlled a sprawling network of highly successful companies across 3 different continents. His professional reputation in the business world was entirely legendary. He was widely known to be exceptionally tough, yet fundamentally just, highly demanding of his partners, but fiercely loyal to those who proved their true worth. Most importantly, he possessed a rare, uncanny ability to clearly see raw, hidden talent in places where other, more superficial executives only saw polished, empty appearances. Alexander had spent countless agonizing months desperately attempting to secure a face-to-face meeting with this legendary titan of industry. He had aggressively sent dozens of elaborate business proposals that were promptly ignored by the executive assistants. He had made numerous frantic telephone calls that were simply never returned. He was on the verge of complete professional despair until finally a very fortunate mutual contact managed to crack open the heavy metaphorical door. The extremely high-stakes dinner was meticulously organized at one of the absolute most exclusive, ridiculously expensive restaurants in the bustling heart of New York City. Alexander had gone to great lengths to secure a highly private, soundproofed dining room tucked away in the back of the establishment, specifically ensuring that absolutely no one would dare to interrupt their crucial negotiations. The heavy oak table was impeccably prepared long before they even arrived. There were crisp, blindingly white linen tablecloths that felt like heavy silk, an array of sparkling crystal glasses designed for several specific different types of expensive wine, and a very rare, incredibly costly bottle of vintage Spanish Reserve that Alexander had specifically selected just to aggressively project an image of immense wealth. Elaborate artisan breads and delicate imported olives were perfectly arranged as a preliminary appetizer. Absolutely every single detail was mathematically calculated by Alexander to forcefully project a flawless image of extreme sophistication and untouchable financial success. He aggressively insisted that Clara accompany him to this specific dinner because he had recently read, in some pretentious glossy business magazine, that traditional Japanese executives highly valued the wholesome image of a stable family man. The article claimed that seeing an executive sitting beside a conventionally attractive, quietly supportive wife successfully transmitted an aura of profound stability, maturity, and absolute reliability. Before they even stepped out of their luxury apartment, Alexander harshly warned her to strictly limit herself to offering pleasant smiles and looking physically beautiful. He sternly commanded her not to speak too much, and absolutely under no circumstances was she to offer any personal opinions regarding his intricate business proposal, brutally reminding her that the only thing she would ever accomplish by speaking would be to deeply embarrass him in front of someone incredibly important. Clara obediently sat at the lavishly decorated table, wearing the incredibly expensive ivory-colored silk blouse that Alexander had explicitly approved for the evening. She wore the heavy, slightly uncomfortable gold earrings that he had specifically purchased for her to wear strictly on highly important occasions, exactly like this one. She sat with perfect posture, successfully projecting the exact precise image of the flawlessly beautiful, eternally silent, completely submissive wife that her controlling husband constantly demanded. When Mr. Tanaka finally arrived, flanked by his quiet assistants, he warmly greeted her with immense politeness in perfect English. He offered a slight, deeply respectful bow of his head, showcasing that traditional, beautiful Japanese formality that Clara still intimately knew and deeply respected. Clara responded with the exact measured demure politeness that was strictly expected of her in that moment. She offered absolutely no outward indication, no subtle twitch of the eye, nor any slight shift in posture that she deeply understood every single complex nuance of Tanaka's cultural body language, or that she could easily comprehend every whispered Japanese phrase he occasionally exchanged with his private secretary. The tense dinner progressed with apparent normalcy during the very first incredibly long hour. Clara sat perfectly still, delicately sipping her water, appearing completely detached from the heavy corporate atmosphere, while internally she was sharply absorbing absolutely every single microscopic detail of the interaction. Alexander aggressively launched into his highly rehearsed, flashy presentation of his grand business proposal. Clara continued to listen in perfect silence, outwardly playing the part of the beautifully oblivious spouse, yet her sharp mind was actively analyzing every single financial figure he threw across the table. Mr. Tanaka was remarkably sharp. He repeatedly interrupted to ask incredibly incisive, highly complex questions, clearly evaluating not just the financial viability of the proposed tech business, but also deeply analyzing the fundamental moral character of the frantic man who was desperately presenting it. It was precisely at this critical, highly tense juncture that Alexander carelessly committed the absolute most fatal catastrophic error of his entire professional life, an arrogant mistake that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of everyone sitting in that room. Deeply arrogant and completely foolishly believing that Clara possessed absolutely no understanding of foreign languages, Alexander suddenly decided to switch his speech and began speaking directly in Japanese to Tanaka. He did this in a pathetic, clumsy attempt to establish a more intimate, informal connection with the billionaire. In his broken, heavily accented Japanese, Alexander chuckled and bluntly told the powerful investor that his wife sitting beside him was an incredibly simple-minded, intellectually empty woman who completely failed to understand even the most basic concepts of modern business. He laughed as he confessed that he had only brought her along because it visually looked good to have a physically pretty silent doll sitting at the table during these types of formal occasions. He then leaned in closer and shockingly confessed that she was a massive, suffocating burden on his exciting life, describing her as a pathetic woman with absolutely zero ambition and zero intelligence. He proudly promised Tanaka that as soon as this massive investment deal was successfully closed and the funds were safely secured, he would finally have enough personal wealth to swiftly divorce her and quickly find someone far more intellectually suited to his high social position. Clara sat frozen in her expensive chair, absorbing every single razor-sharp word of his cruel confession with an entirely impassive, perfectly composed face. All her long, difficult years of forced practice in the painful art of invisibility successfully allowed her to completely mask the sudden immense wave of agonizing heartbreak and boiling rage that violently crashed over her. She somehow managed to maintain her pleasant, politely vacant smile, even as deep within her soul, that previously mentioned cracked glass, finally spectacularly shattered into a million irreparable pieces. But the profound breaking of her spirit did not happen in the tragic weeping manner that Alexander would have ever expected. Instead of crumbling into a puddle of tears, a sudden blindingly clear wave of absolute liberation violently washed through her veins. Across the table, Mr. Tanaka listened carefully to Alexander's deeply despicable, highly unprofessional confession without allowing his facial expression to change even a fraction of an inch. He flawlessly utilized that ancient, refined Japanese art of maintaining absolute stoic calm, a skill he had perfectly mastered over several long decades of engaging in incredibly difficult, highly hostile corporate negotiations. When Alexander finally finished his pathetic, arrogant little speech, loudly taking a sip of his expensive wine, Tanaka simply nodded his head very slowly. And then, the legendary billionaire did something that absolutely no one in that private dining room could have ever possibly anticipated. He deliberately turned his entire body away from Alexander, looked directly into Clara's eyes, and spoke beautifully fluent, highly formal Japanese directly to her. In a calm, deeply respectful tone, he directly asked her exactly what she personally thought about the complex business proposal her husband had just spent the last hour presenting. The heavy, suffocating silence that immediately crashed down upon the room was absolutely total. You could hear the faint humming of the air conditioning. Alexander violently jerked his head, staring wildly at Tanaka with profound, unadulterated confusion, completely failing to understand why this incredibly powerful billionaire was suddenly addressing his supposedly foolish wife in a complex language that she supposedly had absolutely no knowledge of. But then Clara opened her mouth. And when she finally spoke, she responded in utterly perfect, exquisitely fluid, high-level Japanese. She spoke with the undeniable, breathtaking elegance of a highly educated scholar who had meticulously studied the language for years and had passionately practiced it with native speakers. She confidently told Mr. Tanaka that her husband's flashy proposal unfortunately contained several massive, glaring structural weaknesses that she had easily identified right from the very beginning of the presentation. With clinical, ruthless precision, she eloquently explained that Alexander's financial projection numbers were absurdly, dangerously optimistic. She pointed out that his entire market analysis completely ignored three major heavily entrenched competitors. And she correctly noted that his proposed entry strategy completely lacked the deeply necessary cultural sensitivity required to successfully penetrate the traditional Japanese tech market. Alexander simply sat there, staring blankly at her, with his mouth hanging wide open, completely incapable of processing the shocking reality unfolding right before his very eyes. The supposedly foolish, purely decorative wife he had aggressively despised for years was expertly dismantling his entire life's work in a Japanese dialect that was vastly superior to his own. Mr. Tanaka genuinely smiled for the very first time that entire evening. What Alexander absolutely did not know, and what he had never once bothered to discover about his own brilliant wife, was that Mr. Tanaka had authorized a massive, deeply thorough background investigation into Clara long before he had ever formally accepted this meeting. It was his strict, unwavering standard operating protocol to deeply investigate not just the primary executive, but their entire inner circle and family environment, before ever considering handing over a massive financial investment. The private investigators' extensive research had uncovered remarkable data that had genuinely surprised even a seasoned veteran like Tanaka. The detailed reports clearly showed that Clara Vance had been one of the absolute most outstanding, highest-ranking students in the entire history of her university's business department. Her complex senior thesis, specifically focusing on market entry strategies in emerging Asian economies, had been widely published in several highly prestigious international academic journals. The investigators had spoken to her former professors, who all distinctly remembered her as a fiercely brilliant, unstoppable mind, with a profoundly promising future. A brilliant star who had inexplicably, tragically vanished from the professional world immediately after getting married. Tanaka had ultimately decided to attend this dinner not simply to evaluate Alexander's inherently flawed proposal, but because he deeply wanted to personally meet Clara. And what he had witnessed throughout the evening powerfully confirmed exactly what he had deeply suspected all along. He clearly saw that the true, undeniable intellectual talent sitting at that lavish table was absolutely not the arrogant, loud man who never stopped talking, but rather the highly observant, incredibly intelligent woman who had been quietly, patiently listening. Tanaka turned back to Alexander and spoke in perfectly clear English, specifically ensuring there would be absolutely no room for any future misunderstandings. He bluntly informed the arrogant executive that he would absolutely not be investing a single penny in his fragile company. He clarified that his rejection was not simply because the business model was fundamentally flawed, but rather because he fundamentally refused to ever trust or do business